It is on now. Okay. Okay, just quickly before we continue, because I didn't put this map in the slides. So this is just a map of the influence of missionaries in Africa when they came to Africa. And you can see that there's a lot of influence with the missionary expansion. And the colors denote the different types. So red is your Catholic missionary stations where they were positioned. Protestant missionaries are blue. And then there were also Cage and Rueda added to Nathan Nunn's Protestant missionary data. So there is data as well. And these are the green. So you can see that, we are highly influenced by the ideologies that came to Africa with the missionaries, and depending on whether they were Catholics or Protestants, you'll find that that type of religion still continues to be a significant part of our culture. So I just wanted to highlight that, since I didn't touch a lot about missionaries, but missionaries also in the missionary expansion interacts with the colonial expansion. Okay, so we had finished discussing settlement patterns, what motivated where the Westerners decided to settle, and also an interesting sort of strategy they used depending on the type of colonizer was whether they used direct versus indirect rule. And the British really liked to assimilate themselves into the culture. They were all about, okay, you guys can continue with what you're doing, but we will rule over you indirectly, right? And how they did that was that they applied this less hands-on approach where they collaborated with the chiefs to enforce their institutions, to enforce the hard taxes that were introduced at the time, right? To extract a head tax from people. So this gave a very prominent role to the local chiefs. And we all know that some people can become crazy with power, so this is kind of what you end up seeing, is that these prominent roles with the local chiefs made them more accountable to the colonial administration because they were enforcing the institutions which were oppressing their own people. So their own people lost sort of any social trust with their local chiefs, right? So British rule was much more accommodative to native institutions. So their colonial institutions sometimes would actually work alongside your pre-colonial institutions, right? So very accommodative of ethnic leaders, but at the same time, what it was doing was it was cultivating and reinforcing this culture of mistrust between citizens and leaders, and that has just persisted post-colonial. The French administrators, on the other hand, well, they just broke down the indigenous political structures in their colonies, and they would assimilate that population into the French culture. And this is what you find typically in French colonies that, their central bank is in France. Huh? Yeah, that says it all. So what were the interests for colonialism? Well, definitely economic interest. We know this: resource extraction and exploitation of local labor. Trade deals were very significant in the interest of colonial power. Another main reason for colonialism: political interest. We saw where Africa, the continent, is located. The institutions kind of disregarded, or they exploited the the existing governing institutions within the colonies so that they could advance their economic interests, right? So they would use the political institutions to advance their economic interests. And then there was also this aspect of social and cultural assimilation that then came with colonialism, right? So for them, they felt it was a duty to bring civilization to Africa. You know, civilization, Christianity with the missionary expansion, and Western values to African societies, which they often viewed as backward or primitive. Yeah, so locals were forced to adopt colonial culture, religion, language, and norms. And today we still are using those same, colonial culture, religion. Well, I'm instructing you in a colonial language, right? And all of you understand this colonial language. Need I say more? No, there's the assimilation, right? It also created gatekeeper states, colonialism, where vast territories were given as concessions to private corporations. And this was seen in your settler concession plantations or settler concession colonies like DRC, where King Leopold gave a lot of concessions to private corporations to extract rubber from the land, right? And there was also the introduction of marketing boards during colonialism, where the Westerners would buy the local good. If you think of Ghana, where you had the cocoa marketing boards, they were put in place because the Westerners would buy the good from the local farmers at a very, very low price. They would then sell it on the global market at a massive price, accrue these rents, these profits, and they would keep them and not actually reinvest them into the community, because these colonies were simply there for extractive purposes, right? There is literature that shows that colonialism is associated with persistent inequality today, conflict, poor terms of trade, which we have seen, as well as poor education outcomes, poor living standards today, right? And access to public services. So you'll find case study evidence where they will look at several countries that were colonized, and they will show you that, well, or especially the countries that had concessionary boundaries, they'll show you that today, if you go to the communities that live within these concessionary borders where the resources were being extracted, they have poor living, they have poor quality of life compared to communities where they didn't experience the extraction of these natural resources. And this will be within the country. So there's that inequality taking place within the country. Yes, ma'am.
In the colonization era, there's still were differences in the institution, which was attributed to their ability to be able to settle in those countries. It's not really disinterest, but things like that also create differences in the
Yes, exactly. Yes. So the institutions implemented will also cause differences based on, what their interests were in settling there or not settling there. Yes.
Yeah, Prof, you mentioned how missionaries, influenced the institutional structure. I'm also wondering at the influence of the Muslim missionaries. I don't know if that was a thing in Southern Africa. Muslim missionaries, those that left like the Libya, Egypt, into the Sahel,
it's the Islam,
because that really shaped our own institutional structure as well. I don't know if it was also a thing in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa.
So,
if others want to answer, but I've got sort of a response. But so they talk up, so the type of missionaries, they said you'll find that the Westerners tended, when the colonialism was taking place, they tended to settle where there was higher presence of Catholic and Protestant missionaries, which was in Southern Africa. And they didn't tend to settle in areas where there was the Muslim type of missionaries, because there was too much of a clash in their culture. So you find in the North African or wherever, in areas in a country where the missionaries were more Muslim, you won't find a lot of investments or like European settling there.
Okay, I totally agree with you, because there's that disparity between northern and southern Nigeria.
Is there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Southern Nigeria is a lot more developed than northern Nigeria.
And did they settle in southern?
Yes, but not in northern.
And the northern had the missionaries, which were
the Muslim missionaries. Yeah,
that's interesting.
Prof, can I please see the map that you?
It's in the, so the paper is in the folder. Yeah, the whole paper is in the folder. Yeah, I missed putting this map in the slides because I didn't really focus much on missionaries, because they're sort of very embedded with colonial expansion. Yeah, but yeah, the map is there in the Google folder with the paper.
So I wanted to say something with the question she was asking.
Yes.
Yeah.
From this map, it seems like the Catholics were more brave.
So the red dots are your Catholics. So this is where they all are. Yes.
They were more brave to actually be in states where Muslims would also be. And if you look at the southern parts, they didn't go.
Yes. Can you see that? Yeah. These are all Protestants. Yeah. That's true.
And with the...
Yeah. And look at this mass in South Africa, eh? Because this is covering also Lesotho, Swaziland. So there's a lot of missionaries. I know in Zimbabwe we've got a lot of missionary schools. So if you drive from the border, going either to Harare or going either to Bulawayo, after every few kilometers, you'll see missionary school, Saint somebody, all of that. I don't know if you see that when you drive along the... sort of the more and these schools were more in the rural areas than in the urban areas.
Yes.
Right. Okay, let's continue. So maybe there's the one thing about colonial expansion. Yeah, it brought human capital to the rural area. To the rural areas. Okay, so we've spoken about this. So what happened was that at the end of colonial area, you'll find that some regions where Westerners did not settle, you had few railroads, right? Because the investments were limited in those areas. Because what you also found when the Westerners came in is that especially, and the centralized, the big centralized kingdoms found this to be a problem, was that if they didn't go along with what the Westerners wanted, they were denied colonial investments, right? So this again became a reason why you ended up interacting and, trying to assimilate yourself with the Westerners, because you needed the investments. Remember, you had used your investments trying to fight them off, but they had guns, they had steel, so it was a difficult fight, and eventually you had to succumb. So if you were in one of those big kingdoms where you really were trying to push back, that was your punishment. They didn't invest in your region, but they will invest in other regions. So this is what you then find at the end of colonial era, is that where the Westerners were not happy with you, or they didn't settle because you guys were an unruly bunch that was always fighting with them, investments were limited.
But were these investments commensurate to were they actually substantial in terms of were the investments substantial?
We'll come to the literature that looks at at whether the investments that were being put there, if you think they were substantial, it's subjective. That's a subjective question.
Because we had some infrastructure before we came in. We had our local ways of building stuff and stuff like that. And those things are still there. And then we cannot say that we can attribute it to their investment and stuff.
It's subjective because then maybe if you go into a country where they didn't have that amount of investment, if you ask people from that country, especially the smaller kingdoms, they'll probably tell you that, well, they did bring in quite an amount of investment. We've got better road infrastructure, we've got buildings. So it's very subjective depending on, where you come from and what was the environment in that particular region at the time when the colonizers came in. Because definitely in your bigger centralized states, we've already seen they were already engaged in a lot of the infrastructure and everything. So for them, the returns from colonialism would have been very marginal. If anything, it took them backwards, right? But for some kingdoms or regions, it pushed them forward. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. I saw Lovemore, and then I'll come to Mpumsi.
The whole idea of this colonialism and then the institutions, the basic, or we should attribute it to more like the mortality rates at that time, because that also contributed to whether
they settled. Yes. So that is true, that if they were dying in their numbers, they didn't settle there. They were smart. They were smart to realize that, look, it's not going to work for us here. So let's just take what we came from and leave as quickly as we can. Right? But because it was an extractionary type or an expropriation type of colonization, they didn't build infrastructure. They didn't put in any type of institutions. They didn't invest in the human capital of the local people, right? Because they were there for a temporary reason. It's interesting that you speak about that, because when you think of current leaders, sometimes you find there was this literature I was looking at where they were looking at the types of leaders that you have, and they said you can have I can't remember the term they used for the leader, but definitely. But what they meant to say was that sometimes you can have autocratic leaders, but depending on whether that autocratic leader is there to stay. If he's there to stay, he may become benevolent, which means he's going to invest in the economy because he knows he needs to expropriate. So he needs a thriving economy for him to survive. But if you have a roaming or a non-stationary leader, I'll try and find the terminology they used, a non-stationary leader who's just there and knows that I'm here for this term only and there will be no other opportunity for me. He goes there, he extracts and expropriates as much as he can without caring of the damage that he's leaving within that country. So it's interesting the parallels you can draw from the colonial type of institutions and some of the current leaders that we might encounter in the world today. Lovemore and then Pumsi.
I was just wondering if we can even celebrate these investments as investments, because I believe the infrastructure that was being built in Africa was mostly to facilitate the extraction of African resources and the movement of these resources to Europe. So I wonder if we can even term it investment.
Okay, so this is what this map is going to explain, exactly to that point. Pumsi, you.
I wanted to answer on the question of whether the investments were substantial. So I think South Africa provides a very good case study because the apartheid government actually took the model of the British colonizers within South Africa, and then they divided South Africa into TBVC states, which is Transkei, Maputo, Venda, and the Ciskei.
Yes.
And then they gave them nominal independence, meaning although they trade using the rand and everything, they were states by their own, with their own armies and their own autonomy, their own police, everything. And then what they would then do, there is what you were saying, Prof, especially the Ciskei. This is the only one I want to draw attention to. Ciskei leaders were mostly towing the line, not questioning, including Maputo. So what they would then do, they would give them a lot of financial aid and stuff, to an extent that people who lived in Maputo then will tell you there was no unemployment in Maputo. They took factories there as well, because those leaders, they wanted to show them what you get if you toe the line. And then the most problematic ones were those ones from the Transkei, where your Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela come from. Those ones were not towing the line, to an extent that they then put Matanzimas, who are not by blood, chieftaincies or royalty. They then removed the real royalties from power and put them, but even then they couldn't manage. And today when you look at Ciskei and Transkei, you can tell. That is the one province, it's the Eastern Cape, but when you are in Ciskei, there are people who are from Transkei who see an elevator for the first time when they are in the Ciskei. That was very, especially if you are far from the capital, like Yomtata, and like, oh, there are elevators here, etc., like Cape Town, things like that. So they were substantial, and there were incentives, to an extent that they fought after apartheid. They fought and didn't want to integrate to South Africa, both Maputo and the Ciskei.
Exactly. Those are colonial legacies that we were left with, right? And that we adopted. So speaking to what Lovemore was saying, this is what happened. This is exactly what you are saying, Lovemore, that at the end of the colonial era, because the colonialism was designed to extract resources, so here they pull out Mozambique. And these, apparently at the end of colonialism, the railroads, these were the only railroads that were put in place in Mozambique, and they are going to the coastal area where they are going to ship the minerals that had been extracted, right? And they say in Mozambique it was a colony that was larger in size than France, but there were just 3 main and 2 subordinate rail lines at the end of their colonialism, right? And these lines connected the coastal areas, or going to the settler colonies. So that was also interesting, is that they'll build roads or railroads that would connect where they were extracting the minerals to where the Westerners had settled. So in Mozambique, that's why you've got that the connection between Johannesburg. You also have a connection to Harare from Mozambique, and also to Malawi, because these 3 were settler colonies. So they needed the resources. Mozambique was not. It was extractive. There was no effort made to connect southern and the central and the northern provinces. There was no effort made to connect the different African countries internally. And if you look at this country, at this map, can you see where all the the roads are? By your coastal countries. Your coastal countries. And the ones that are here, if you look at those countries, those would be the ones where they were settling. So that's why there are roads connecting them. But otherwise, the infrastructure, so you're quite right. You know, the infrastructure at the end of the day, was it really a substantial investment, if at the end we are left with something like this? So we still have to invest in our own internal infrastructure to connect, our own towns, our municipalities together. But where are we going to get the money from? Our resources have been depleted, labor, has been depleted. So where are we going to get the money for new capital investments, right? So we need to start. So this was where the issue was, is how do you jumpstart these colonies that have been drained of resources of wealth. However,
Could I say that there is a good lesson?
yes,
The concept of linkages, creating linkages between your key economic zones. That's what we are not doing with our current government. We are not aggregating, okay, I'll talk from the agriculture sector point of view. We are not aggregating our products because we work in silos, whilst we know that Limpopo is tropical and produces lots of nuts, bananas, and so forth. We haven't heard of a good channel that links Limpopo with the African markets. They are just at the gate of Zimbabwe, but you haven't heard of any major infrastructure development that channels. You were complaining about taking 5 hours standing at the Bay Bridge trying to cross to Zimbabwe. So we need to identify key lessons that we can emulate in our current state. But in terms of the resources to finance those, it's a big question, because when you were going through your slides, you showed that in Venezuela they went for these radical policies like nationalization. I wish Malema was part of this class so that he can see the damage his objective attitude when he wants to nationalize mines and central bank. Thank you.
yeah, and you're quite right. This is why we sort of read through this literature, look at the case evidences, because there are lessons that can be drawn from that. And we see the lessons, like what you're saying, that what you have taken out of this is that we need to invest in the linkages of not only within our country, but with the neighboring countries within, so that we can improve intra-Africa trade. But then, again, the people that we've put in power, are they looking at it the same way as we are, right? Or are they seeing an opportunity where they can oh, okay, I can invest in this, but I must get a certain percentage from that. Yeah. So here's the good, so here let's talk about the opposite side of colonialism, right? We cannot ignore the fact that there was, we cannot undersell colonial investments in Africa. And there is enough literature. And if you look at the slides, at the 3 slides of references, you will find papers that talk to this, right? So there's enough literature that regions where Westerners settled, they invested in schools, right? We saw that they worked with the missionaries and they invested in schools, they invested in clinics. These regions therefore have better human capital today, better infrastructure, better health outcomes, better property rights today, right? So evidence shows that individuals who attended colonial schools, I am one of those, I have a higher living standard, I am more likely to work outside of agriculture, I'm here, right? So that's true, I'm in academia, and I'm more likely to be politically active. No, I am not politically active, but their children are more likely to be educated. Yes, my children are being educated, right? So there are those colonial investments that are coming through, right? And yes, inclusive institutions such as property rights were put in place so that it could incentivize people to be more innovative and technology. But that, yes.
Again,
Yes.
we had a debate with my learned friend here, Doc, when we were having lunch. The good question that we must ask those imperialists is, if you were not here, out of all these 2 centuries, do you still think that you would be still in the bushes and wearing blankets and not modernized. No. So they can take away their property rights and education. We would still educate ourselves.
We would
had
have
indigenous knowledge. We had scientific knowledge that was indigenous, that we inherited from our forefathers. So we had hunting tactics. They get hunting tactics from YouTube. We used to learn behaviors of animals.
Yes, because we have the animals. We have the animals. Yeah, and yeah, exactly.
Stop teaching us what is not correct.
Yeah, it's so. You know, and that's what's interesting, right? Is that because we don't have a counterfactual, we will never know how we would have developed absence of slave trade, absence of colonialism, right? Because the whole of Africa was affected, you know. So it's always interesting that we really and truly believe that we would still have developed, and I think that we would have, because if you look at history, all the other countries that also went through their events, their shocks to their economies, their wars, their, political instability, but they came out at the other end. I mean, Western Europe is one of them, right? You had the Romans trying to civilize the entire Western Europe, right? So there was that whole era there, but somehow they managed to come out of it. They're developed and everything. So maybe if we had been left to our own devices, we would have happened, The counter to that is people say, well, maybe, yes, we would have developed, but it would have been at a slower rate than if they hadn't come, because now we adopted their technology. So then we go back to our growth models of marginal returns, that the returns were now quicker for us and we're able to develop at a faster rate than if we hadn't been colonized, right? So there's the counter.
Machines to process skins and hides.
Yes.
And yet our coins and sand, tribes would wear the skins that they would extract from after hunting the wild animal.
Yeah. Yes, Mary. You had your hand up. And I'll come to you, love. Oh, yes, and Darlington, yes.
Doc, I'm almost scared to share my thoughts.
No, share your thoughts. This is why we had...
Totally agree with the
yes,
consensus.
Yeah.
I'm trying, you mentioned slave trade, and I'm trying to compare regions where slave trade was prominent in Western Africa with regions where slave trade wasn't prominent.
So Southern Africa.
Southern Africa, within
West Africa.
Yeah, we can compare Western and Southern Africa.
All right.
They are different dynamics.
Okay.
And I'm tempted to think that those regions where slave trade was common are more developed than the others.
So now you...
No, I'm just saying that there are other dynamics in place. Like, for instance, in Niger, slave trade wasn't there, but they had the old French regime that was really restrictive, right? But then you look at places like Togo, and then it is quite dicey. And then you look at Northern and Southern Korea history.
Yes.
And even though colonialism is not per se the same, but South Korea is doing a lot better today than North Korea. And we know the influence of these colonies.
The Western, that's the only difference, right, that we see as separating North Korea and South Korea, is that South Korea adopted open policies, North Korea refused, because their cultures are similar, religion is similar, geography. Yes.
And then Northern and Southern Nigeria is almost the same thing. These guys infiltrated Southern Nigeria and, they developed it in, not really, let's not say they did, no, they didn't. And then Northern Nigeria. So I'm tempted to think that, of course, we would have developed, but at our own pace, which would have been more sustainable. Yeah, because we developed now at their own pace, and it is no longer
which was not sustainable.
Yeah, but honestly, I think that it triggered some level of development. But then we wouldn't say because some good came out of the bad situation, it justifies it. No, it doesn't.
It doesn't justify it, yeah. Okay. Point taken. Darlington, and then Abigail, and then Love.
just finally on this.
On yours.
We were not in a hurry.
We are on African time, right? Always on African time. Yeah.
Okay, let's just look at what is happened to the introduction of the climate script.
Of which one?
The climate.
Okay,
The whole of the corona era was a really productive video of the introduction of North American climate. In North America, sorry. No. You can't produce anything. It's not saying this. But that's your Western development. But before that, there was nothing like that.
And we were still growing.
We just grow crops.
And we're using manure from the animals.
At no cost. And now the Western countries are using the very same raw material to produce renewable energy. Now they're taking the sludge from the farms and producing pay for powering their processing plants.
Thank you. So, on the debate on whether the colonialism was beneficial or not, and whether Africa was going to develop in the absence of colonialism or not, I think we can use the example of Ethiopia, which was not colonized by any other country, and compare it with those which were colonized. And as we can see right now, Ethiopia is still doing okay, although it's still poor, but
And it's got conflict, internal conflicts, yeah.
yes, they still have their infrastructure and everything, which is almost the same as those countries which were colonized.
And I mean, even the countries that were colonized today, some of them still have internal conflict. So, love more.
Yes, just to add what I can say, I think it's like a fish that has been taken out of the water and being taught to live on land. I think that's exactly what happened in Africa. And that's why we're struggling today. That's why we're having all these issues. I think a good example is China. Yeah, they were semi-colonized, but they were never fully controlled by another country. And look at China today. They developed at their own pace, and I believe Africa was going to also do the same. Using our own knowledge systems, being united. One of the reasons why Africa struggles today is the fragmentation. We don't have one voice. We're just small little countries. We are easily overpowered. For example, the European Union, they came together. Yeah. But Africa, we are standing on our own. We see that. So I believe colonialism isn't really was uncalled for.
It's like our birth certificates, right? I've got my indigenous name, but, my colonial name is the one. Yeah, it's Carolyn. It's a colonial name, but I've got my indigenous name, Netsitsi, but no one knows that it exists because, I speak the colonial language. I use the colonial name, right?
They came back, right? They start talking about it's now the British to develop like them saying we don't need that for now. Keep it there.
But we didn't do that, yeah.
So then the Western and then the China to.
We did open our doors, right? So
I think program must call a press briefing and respond to Trump.
We should. Yes. A press briefing, yeah? And guys, I'm going to give you an opportunity, yes, because everyone here is spoken.
I'm thinking here, so looking at how long the European countries has been from the issues of colonialism, if we remove ourselves from them, how long do you think it will take for us to be the African superpower? Because I think it's not going to happen just like that. It took so long, and even today, we are still doing it in many areas. So we might not even live to realize that African people need to survive.
And it also took the Europeans, the Western Europe, a long time to become a dominant power, right? However, I do think that they got exponential returns when they started extracting resources, right? So then they started growing at a much faster rate. Because without that, yes, they probably would still have developed, but it should have been also at a slower rate, like what we are saying, right? So maybe there was a mutual thing that happened when they did come to extract from us and they left some of the investments here. It helped us to also start growing at a faster rate.
Yeah, because I think as Africans we also need to colonize the new generation that will be coming, so that we all think the same way, that we want to remove ourselves
from, yes. And I think that's what they're trying to do in Sahel, right? Is that they're really trying to remove the French influence from that region and say, we can do this by ourselves. And I like that mindset. I would like that mindset to spill over without too much violence taking place. But I you know, they always say there's and there's paper, there's literature that shows that sometimes conflict is necessary to rebuild a state. So sometimes you have to just completely dismantle all the institutions that are in place and then rebuild again.
So, Prof, I'm also wondering, on the other side of the coin, I'm wondering that how we would have communicated, how much we would have integrated without colonization. Yes, it's true that they fostered division among us and they made us hate each other, but somehow our major tool for communication are these colonial languages, French and English. And I'm also wondering at how trade was facilitated without, yes, we had our own ways in West Africa, but then I doubt perhaps, you know, would really be so integrated traveling across Africa.
And that's not happening, yeah. Yeah. And we don't see it happening, but you know, so I think I like the AfCFTA, African Continental Free Trade. What they have in mind is to really try and integrate the African continent. So I think that's where they're trying to push, you know, the trajectory of African trade, and I really hope that it will be implemented and it will be sustainable as well.
Observes the dynamics that are there, the ethnic differences,
Yes.
the existing trade relations. It observes that.
Yeah.
But they're saying, let's find each other.
Yeah, exactly.
African countries.
Yeah. I mean, why, let's trade with each other. Imagine if we traded more with each other and started saying, well, you know, I'm going to trade with my neighboring countries in Africa, so I'm going to half the resources I'm sending to America and everything. It's going to be a wake-up call for them as well. And then they're going to be like, okay, we'll offer you higher prices, you know. Yeah.
Now, leaders will say, hi, we want this higher price, we will back to stage.
So here is a clear example. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes,
Now, I want to say, so can you say AU as an institution is also problematic because they are not doing such things. They say Africa let's be one, and let's protect what we have here and develop.
I have such serious problems with the African Union. I don't see the relevance of African Union. But this is just me personally, because, you know, because we did call out for help in Zimbabwe at a time. African Union said, no, it's a sovereign country, do what it wants. Ethiopia has got AU headquartered there, and look at the chaos that's happening in Ethiopia. So what is their relevance?
So I'll give you an example of what you've just said, in terms of promoting the intra-trade within the African states. For the past 2 to 3 years, Zimbabwe has been battling with clouds. Last year, when China decided to say, America, go to hell, there has been a huge demand for maize from China. And South Africa was struggling in terms of the harvest. And we had a bumper harvest for the past 2 years. And we were so happy that our prices, surface prices are going up, but here's an opportunity in China. Whereas our brothers just above the Congo River are battling with famine.
Yes.
And they are relying on the United Nations. The media is there, it's been showing those
heartbreaking scenes in Zimbabwe.
Yes.
And instead of saying we will trade using the rand value with you guys in Zimbabwe, our surplus produce will go to you before we consider exporting to China. Would we have lost anything?
Not
No.
at all. Not at all. Shane, did you have any- she could have-
I just wanted to comment on the issue of, the relevance of conflicts. So I just wanted to comment on Rwanda, because, the genocide, the conflict, the tribal, conflict, and now the way Rwanda is progressing. So I just wanted to confirm with you if that issue of conflict holds for Rwanda. If it's
So actually, that genocide was because of Western influence. Because when they were there, they had ethnic favoritism, so they uplifted a certain tribe into political positions at the expense of the other tribe, and this is what then caused the genocide to take place in Rwanda. Yes, Koda.
I can't quite remember because.
'Cause-
Yeah. You were talking of AU, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was saying it's going to be hard for the AU to really have a strong voice because I think some of the projects it implements, they are funded in the headquarters was built by the Chinese. So I think until we have total independence of these key institutions, then if we don't achieve that, then we might not really develop in the way we want to develop as Africans, to have this Pan-African. Then we were talking of AFTA. I mean, I don't know how that's going to play out because already individual countries have trade agreements with EU, China, and so forth. And even within the region, SADC has its own trade protocols and COMESA, ECOWAS, and so on. So I think there's no harmony in the way in which we have these trade agreements and trade programs in Africa and also amongst the countries. I think that's something that needs to...
Yeah, that's something. It's going to be challenging, right? Because you're quite right that there are all these different types of trade blocks in Africa, and we've already got these deals with the Western world as well. But I still think that we can, come up with a cohesive trade or a trade arrangement or trade patterns that would be conducive to Africa before we actually start thinking of developing other nations with our wealth as well. So yes, it's definitely going to be challenging. I think, coming up with institutional reforms, it's always challenging in any country, in any region. But they do happen, and some are sustainable as well. But we just need to be willing to, to move with the times, to understand how is this sort of this after, how is it going to benefit Africa? And again, it also comes back to convincing your people about the benefits of this. And if you don't have that social trust or capital with your people, that's where your challenges also come again. And this is what we struggle with, right? So this is a good plan, but will they be able to convince a very frustrated nation or continent that it can work if we just come together? I think the debate came in where could I say if you end up using a common monetary, you might then make yourself susceptible to financial shocks such as the global, such as a financial shock. So, and then he was given the example of the European Union because they all use the euro. So then the debate became, okay, well, we know there's this lesson, so maybe if we do adopt something similar, we would have to be cognizant of that fact. Yeah. Okay. back. You guys are not allowing me to speak about the positives about yeah, so I think that's what Kuda was highlighting, that because there's so many of these sort of trade blocks within Africa, trying to create a unified trade bloc of all the countries is going to be very challenging indeed. But yeah, we will wait to see how that's going to progress as well. All right, so we said that colonial individuals came with, better schools, better standards of living, and they also brought inclusive institutions such as property rights, right? But at the time that they were bringing in these inclusive institutions, they were really put in place simply to safeguard the wealth of the colonizers, right? Not necessarily to enrich the indigenous populations. So if we think of the settler colonies, the one thing that was extracted from the settler colonies was farming land, right? So they settled there and they extracted there was expropriation of farming land. This was a big strategy for their accumulation of wealth. And this was also a big motivator for them installing property rights to safeguard their land ownership. So example, in South Africa, 88% of the land was occupied by the Westerners, who constituted only 20% of the population, while the majority of the indigenous people were pushed into the Bantustans, and they had to survive on 12% of land. The institutions, these property title deeds that we are speaking about, land title deeds, they were implemented during that period to safeguard that 88% of land that was being used by a very small percentage of the population during that time. And today, this remains a contentious debate, right? Now we are post-colonial, there's this whole debate about redistribution of land. In addition, they created a dual economy in South Africa, where you've got a traditional sector and an urban sector. Similarly, in Zimbabwe as well, we also, most of us are aware of the land redistribution, what happened when it was implemented. It was a good policy, but when it was implemented, it happened under violent conditions and it had severe consequences on the agricultural sector, and you can see Zimbabwe has struggled to recover from that whole land redistribution. So parts of Africa, not only South Africa, Zimbabwe, you've got Kenya, you've got Malawi, parts of Africa where the Europeans settled inherited this complex land ownership issue that continues to challenge us today. And one of the problem is that when the Westerners came, this whole strategy of dismantling the institutions that are in place, or imposing your institutions on top of the pre-colonial institutions, was the problem with the land, is because in most of these African countries, pre-colonial land ownership was communal, right? It was communal. But colonialism created this pocket of private ownership of land that became highly developed. Because the financial systems that they also put in place were based on a Western model, right, of private ownership and collateral based. So if you want collateral, you've got your title deed, it's your land, you can go, you will get your the banks will give you the loan. You go to the banks today and you say it's communal land, do they give you the loan? No, they don't give you the loan, because they don't respect, or the banks were not designed to take communal land as a collateral, because for them they're saying who owns it, and you can't go there and say, well, my community owns it. They want to know who owns the land. A person must own that land, or a family must own that land. But that was not the case, right? So there's this interesting paper that does look at whether Africa is culturally unsuited for property rights, given how communities organize around land, and that it was a communal land ownership is mainly communal within parts of Africa, right? So today you find that communal areas in parts of Africa, they remain underdeveloped because of the financial systems do not recognize traditional systems of land tenure, right? So if you want to improve your communal land, and you need that loan, it's going to be difficult because you probably will not get any or the banks will not recognize that as collateral. And this is really a big issue even today in many parts of Africa. And is it a question of that we need to have, we need to reform our institutions surrounding land, surrounding the land ownership rights, such that we allow, for communal land to be used as collateral when you want to apply for loans to develop your land? That's a question that we'll have to continue debating, right? So I want to end today with a few case studies on different countries in Africa and sort of their development paths. First one, obviously, Nigeria, colonized by Britain. In Nigeria, resource exploitation, oil was the strategy of the British colonialism, and Nigeria fell to, into the pitfalls of the natural resource curse, which led to these problems that we are observing today. Corruption, poor institutional quality, unstable economy. Diversification has also been extremely challenging in Nigeria. However, I do want to say, though, because I do follow sort of the developments that are happening within Africa. And Nigeria has really been trying to leverage on its internal factors to develop the country these days. So they really have some, ideas of what they want to, how they want to develop Lagos. I've seen sort of papers where they're looking at, the investments that are going through and how they would want Lagos to be sort of the trade hub, a global trade hub, because they are in a very advantageous position by the Atlantic trade routes here as well. So that was a British colony. Then we have DRC. This is a Belgium. They were colonized by Belgium. DRC. So DRC was a settler concession, which means it was just exploitation in this country of the labor and of the natural resources. So there was intense exploitation, especially in the mining industry. This period saw, and this had a lasting impact on their instability. They've got governance problems. They still have conflict. And this is kind of a legacy that they were left with, right? So King Leopold granted so many concessions in exchange for fees and investments in roads, railroads, and local infrastructure in Belgium. But what happened in most cases was that such development was very minimal in comparison to the exploitation of the natural resources. So yes, these private corporations came in and they were, investing in infrastructure in DRC, but today we see that it was when you compare with the profits that they made, the investment was extremely minimal. We've got Côte d'Ivoire. It used to be called Ivory Coast, but now it's Côte d'Ivoire. French colonialism, right? They were colonized by the French. And so because they were colonized by the French, they have a monoculture. So remember, the French had a different type of colonial strategy. They took over They assimilated the culture into the French culture, whereas the British, they would work side by side with the local people. So, the French they enforced the cultivation of cocoa and other cash crops, and the Ivorian economy was heavily dependent on these products, right? And this made the country vulnerable to the Dutch disease, to price fluctuations in the world market of cocoa. Obviously, there would be marketing. Your cocoa marketing boards are also involved in there. There were power structures as well, where the French created a colonial power structure that was adopted. This is the sad part, right? So they created these power structures that were then adopted by the local leaders post-independence. And then this has led to a concentration of power within a cabal, right? And obviously what comes with that, corruption, and it also causes ethnic divisions within the country. There were very limited opportunities for Ivorians during colonialism, and again, this created inequality within the economy. So even though you might see there was some development or some investment in schools and healthcare facilities, the indigenous populations were largely excluded from these positions of power and influence during colonialism. So this has just resulted in the post-independence instability that we find in Côte d'Ivoire as well. And with the French as well, they've continued to have a very significant French influence in their French colonies. So they still continue to have a say in the political and economic decisions of their French colonies. Which is why you find that they are trying to push out the French influence, because they still have it, right? And I guess the one thing they do need to think about is having their own central banks. Because right now, all French colonies, your central bank is in France. And then the last one, diamond of Africa, colonized by Britain. So Botswana's, history is always, or the narrative about Botswana is always told that, yes, despite the fact that they were colonized by the British, they were able to evade many of the traps that were linked to the resource curse, because they already had these strong pre-colonial institutions in place that helped them to sort of, recover post independence. So whether there are lessons to be drawn from here, maybe there are. For our other resource abundant countries, maybe you should, read up about Botswana and how they managed to leverage off their diamond receipts. So these are some of the case studies, and there are many more case studies because, the whole of sub-Saharan Africa was colonized, right? So you can take any case evidence and you'll find that there are these colonial legacies or remnants that continue to persist in Africa. And then South Africa is always interesting, right? Because it's the colonialism, and then you've got the apartheid as well that took place. So how those two interacted, and then, the persistence of those two shocks to South Africa, and the inequalities that we now see in the economy, and how the country is trying to address these inequalities. So yeah, that is what I had for today. I hope it was an interesting discussion on on institutions. And I hope there were lessons that were drawn from our discussions. I think there were a lot. There is a lot of literature that's related to the economic history in Africa, and they even go into the financial sector, how it was structured, the whole creation of central banks as well. So, you know, as I said, if that is something I feel you're interested in, by all means, you know, I think you'll be very successful in publishing as well. Yes. You would, because it's still a very niche market. I mean, economic growth and development, yeah, it's so massive. So, you know, when I send my papers out, I have to be very strategic in the journals that I target. Otherwise, they'll be like, no, this has been done. Yeah. Okay. So that's us today. So there's tea, and then we'll meet tomorrow for our Stata practical.